Joining us, MS Now Chief Political Reporter Chris Jansing, senior writer at Slate and co-host of the Amicus podcast, Mark Joseph Stern, managing editor at The Bulwark and MS Now contributor Sam Stein, and MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell joins us as well. Let's start with the Supreme Court and what we saw today. Mark, I know there's a lot of talk that's about the Federal Reserve and the FTC and the power given to Donald Trump today. But again, I want to zig. And I want to talk about the power that was not given to him. Explain the majority's reasoning in Mississippi.
So this was a very straightforward case because Congress has never actually said that all ballots must be received by Election Day. To be clear, Republican legislators have introduced bills to that effect, but none of them have ever passed. And so right now, there are 30 states that count these ballots as long as they're sent by Election Day. And this case was an attack on those states and on their laws. And as you said, Katie, by a 5-4 vote, Justice Barrett rejected that argument and said, look, we don't really care if it's good policy to count these ballots or not. The only question for us is whether the federal government has preempted or overridden the states that choose to count them. And the answer is clearly no. The best that the plaintiffs could point to were statutes that simply set the date of the election in law. And so they claimed that by setting an election date, that Congress had implicitly created a date by which ballots must be received. And Justice Barrett, to her credit, I think this is obviously correct, said, look, there's nothing in the word election that means the ballots have to be received by then. As long as people are casting their vote, it's okay for these late arriving ballots to be tallied for the final count. That is a very good decision for 30 states and their voters.
Yeah, so I was gonna mention, we can put up on the screen all the states and territories that currently accept ballots after Election Day as long as they are postmarked on Election Day. If the federal government had sided with the RNC, what would that have meant, Mark, for all these other states and territories?
Yeah, and so I'll just add, in addition to those states, there are several more that count ballots that are sent overseas that arrive slightly late, including for military members who are stationed overseas. So this decision would have been devastating for those individuals, and I think it would have had a disproportionate impact on our armed forces troops who are stationed overseas. But also, this would have been really bad for rural voters, including probably a lot of Republican voters who live in far-flung places whose ballots take a while to reach the state. What this would have meant if the plaintiffs had prevailed, if the court had gone the other way, is that those ballots would not count for federal elections if they arrive after Election Day, but they could still count for state elections. That's a strange twist here. So we would have had election administrators having to segregate out these ballots, still counting them for state elections, but then tossing them out for federal elections. It would have been very chaotic, and the court was simply not willing to go there.
There was a dissent. This was Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. Sam Stein, I'll give this to you. They wrote, allowing absentee ballots to pour in over the days and weeks after Election Day creates greater opportunity for fraud and risks further undermining the public's confidence in election integrity. Again, written by Justice Alito. Sounds a lot like Donald Trump, Sam.
Well, yeah, it does. One is, what is the actual evidence of fraud that they're talking about? This has been looked into ad nauseum, obviously, since 2020, and we found painfully little instances of electoral fraud. It doesn't stop Donald Trump from saying it's happening. In fact, Donald Trump continues to this day, including in the California elections that just took place, to cast doubt on the idea that mail-in balloting is legitimate. But there is not evidence there. And I will just say this public perception and the public confidence in the elections, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, Donald Trump is the one who has predominantly cast doubt on the legitimacy of these elections. In doing so, he has harmed public confidence in elections. To then turn around and point to that and say, well, you can't have mail-in balloting because you might hurt public confidence in the elections without acknowledging that it's Trump himself who's caused it. Seems a little bit specious to me, but I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to be on the Supreme Court. But none of these seem to be grounded in the law or in reality, frankly.
Well, the reality, Chris, is that elections officials across the country have to deal with this sort of rhetoric and the undermining of our electoral system, of our elections. The president has been going after it for years. He's been effective in casting and creating doubt. What are they doing?
So they're doing a lot. And first of all, they say, look, he's been trying to confuse and intimidate voters for a long time. But they say and they believe a lot of the public are onto him. They will acknowledge back in 2020, they were surprised by the depth and breadth of the lengths Donald Trump was willing to go to try to say he won that election and steal that election back. But what they're seeing and what they're experiencing is that more and more people say, no, you're not going to take our right away to vote. No, we're not going to be confused. Look, they have said for a while they believed that the lower his approval ratings were, the more Republicans were worried about losing the House, the more he would flood the zone. But I spoke with, among other people, Mo Ivory. She is likely the incoming chair of the Fulton County, obviously ground zero for election interference, the Fulton County Elections Commission chair. Listen to what she said about how she views all this.
We don't have an election administration problem. We have an intrusion voter intimidation problem. That is what happens when intimidation becomes the plan. And that's what's happened in our country, right?
Donald Trump says, for example, he regrets not seizing Georgia's voting machines after 2020. He has been very clear that he is prepared, and lawyers for Republicans have been very clear. They're very prepared to mount challenges come the midterms. That can't be fun.
Yeah. Oh, of course not. And they've lost every single one of those challenges over and over and over. And so that's the playbook, right? Continue to try to use the law, use intimidation, misinformation to get people to be fearful of it. And that just doesn't work. It doesn't work.
They've got thousands and thousands of lawyers who are ready for that flooding of the zone. They know what's going to happen. They know what his plan is. But look, they're watching closely. They're watching closely in the places that are going to be very close. And look, they say, we can't stop them from doing what they're doing. What we can do is to be prepared, is to mitigate, is to push back and do what they did last week. They won 5 important cases. Now they've won the 6th today. And they say that sends a message, too, they hope, to voters.
But that push, continue to push regardless of the push back that Donald Trump has received. We're seeing it as well in Congress. He's pushing the Save America Act. Pushing, Michael. And he's getting pushback from Republicans, including Thom Tillis and Majority Leader Thune, who say that it's just not possible to get this thing over the line. Held hostage by this has been the housing bill, which Speaker Mike Johnson, I guess, sent to the president today. Is it going to get signed?
Well, Katie, that's the big question here, right? And you're right. Speaker Mike Johnson did transmit that bill from the House to the White House officially today, which is notable because it's a delay. This bill passed the House and Senate last week. It could have been sent over immediately. But then the president threw this bombshell into the mix, saying that he would not sign the housing bill until there was movement on the Save America Act, which you rightly point out, Katie, is never going to pass. It does not have the votes, both the Republican votes or the Democratic votes. Yet, as you said, the president keeps pushing for it. On the point of the housing bill, which, by the way, members of both parties want to see it signed into law. It would make housing more affordable for millions of Americans across the country. Particularly Republicans saw this as a piece of legislation that they could point to on the campaign trail, that they are doing something about this affordability crisis in the country. But the president then cut the ground out from under their feet. So now President Trump has 10 days to deal with this legislation. He can either sign it into law, which a lot of members are hoping he will do. He could veto it, which would send it back to Congress. You would need 2/3 support in both chambers to override that veto, which in theory would be possible and likely, given the fact that more than 300 members of the House and more than 80 members of the Senate approved this bill. But then it would force Republicans to go against President Trump, which we both know they don't like to do very often. And then the other possibility is the president just doesn't sign it and then it becomes law in 10 days. So no indication right now of how he is going to handle it. But again, the 10-day clock starts now. I can tell you a lot of Republicans are not happy with how this has been working, both behind the scenes and also publicly. Again, they wanted this housing bill to be passed. A lot of folks are saying, is this the president just not caring about the midterm elections? Affordability is going to be the topic come November. Those accusations are not just coming from Democrats. They're not coming from pundits. They're coming from within the GOP ranks as well. I want to read you one quote that I heard from a GOP Senate aide last week after the president had canceled that that signing ceremony. This aide told me, quote, "We saw glimpses of this during Trump's first administration, but never in my lifetime have I seen a president so deliberately attempt to lose majorities for his own party." So there are a lot of concerns with how this has been handled. Again, not just from outside, but from inside the House as well.